Who was Jesus before he turned 30? Most traditional accounts offer silence. A nearly sacred absence covers this period of the life of the man who would change the history of humanity. This gap of almost 2 decades has become fertile ground for theorists, scholars, and seekers of spiritual truth. Were these years a time of quiet learning, of secret retreats in sacred lands? Among the places cited as possible destinations of this enigmatic young man, none echoes as much mystery as Egypt. Not the Egypt of tourist pyramids, but that of the hidden chambers, the living hieroglyphs, and the priests of the inner eye. At the heart of historical silence lies an inevitable question. How did a simple carpenter from Galilee come to express wisdom that echoed universal principles, aligned with teachings found in the papyri of Hermes Trismegistus? The complexity of his parables, the depth of his silences, and the precision of his actions point to something that transcends the ordinary. His spiritual authority was not born solely from divine gift, but perhaps from an ancestral honing, a journey through forgotten schools, hidden to common eyes, but alive in the memory of the initiated. Could the young Jesus have been received by Egyptian instructors in the Valley of Lost Rituals? The Gospels themselves hold silent clues. When the evangelist Matthew reports that Jesus' family fled to Egypt to escape Herod, many see it as just a geographical escape. But what if this displacement was more than protection? What if it was the first step of an initiatory trajectory, a spiritual map disguised as a historical narrative? Egypt, in this context, ceases to be a refuge and becomes a portal to temples where the soul was sculpted with discipline, silence, and light. Throughout antiquity, Egypt was seen as the guardian of great mysteries. Greece, Rome, Persia, all drank from its source but never fully deciphered it. Its schools, some underground, served as centers for spiritual transformation. Not just anyone could enter their corridors. It was necessary to be called, to undergo trials, and to demonstrate purity of intention, and it is precisely this description that coincides with the unofficial accounts of Jesus' silent years. So why then ignore this possibility? The region of Luxor, once Thebes, hides in its sands echoes of chants that did not die. On the banks of the Nile, priests trained disciples in the mastery of the mind, vital energy, and the sacred word. Knowledge that would only later be disguised under the veil of Western esotericism, but which in the schools of Memphis and Heliopolis was the science of the soul. Those who underwent these trainings not only learned, but were transformed. They came out different. How can we not consider that Jesus may have been among these disciples? Many independent scholars have pored over apocryphal manuscripts, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Dead Sea Scrolls, seeking traces of this hidden journey. These texts, although rejected by the canonical tradition, carry symbols, vocabularies, and structures that directly refer to the Hermetic and Egyptian language. There are echoes of Isis, Thoth, and Horus in the words attributed to Jesus. There are mentions of the inner kingdom that resonate with the Egyptian concept of Duat, the spiritual dimension invisible to worldly eyes. This thread of connection becomes even stronger when we observe that Alexandria, an Egyptian city where knowledge from all parts of the ancient world converged, was one of the first major seats of emerging Christianity. It's no coincidence. The Library of Alexandria, destroyed by interests that preferred ignorance to collective awakening, could very well have housed accounts of this hidden phase of Christ. Yes, books were lost, but the questions they generated were not, and one of them echoes more than ever. What did Jesus learn in Egypt? Imagine for a moment the young soul of Jesus contemplating the hieroglyphs that narrated the journey of Osiris. Imagine him observing the rites of passage, silently absorbing the symbols of rebirth, initiatic death, and the ascension of the spirit. All this in hidden chambers beneath the sand, far from the eyes of empires and future dogmatic distortions. The boy who came from Galilee might have transformed into a master through the golden light that still hides today in the temples of Karnak, Edfu, and Abydos. Jesus' own teachings demonstrate echoes of this experience. The use of metaphors, the invitation to self-knowledge, the call to purity of heart, the practice of silence and prayer in secret, all are also pillars of training in the Egyptian mystery schools. This is not to assert an exclusive origin, but to acknowledge possible and rich influences that broaden our understanding of the figure of Christ. And perhaps even more importantly, they point to a spirituality that transcends labels, churches, and borders. This silence of nearly 20 years is, in itself, an invitation, a call to inner search, to openness to what is not in textbooks nor in repeated sermons. The absence of records is, in fact, the presence of an enigma, a space intentionally left so that the curious spirit may rise, investigate, feel. It is in this void that pulses the possibility that Jesus, before preaching on the mountains, may have heard secrets among stone columns bathed in desert light. And it's not just alternative historians who explore this hypothesis. Even respected scholars of the Christian tradition acknowledge that there is a vast gap between the accounts of Jesus' childhood and the beginning of his ministry. The question then is no longer if he was absent, but where and with whom. By tracing the traces of the Egyptian light tradition in the teachings of the Nazarene, we may not only be revealing a hidden past, but also accessing a map to our own awakening. Finally, this quest is not about Jesus alone. It's about us, about our forgotten spiritual heritage, about the treasures that lie buried, not just in the sands of Egypt, but within every human being who longs to understand the mystery of life, death, and eternity. And if Jesus passed through Egypt, perhaps he left signs. Not to create a new religion, but to rekindle a much older flame that still waits today for those who have eyes to see. Even before the word philosophy echoed through the halls of Athens, Egypt was already cultivating a silent knowledge, passed down from generation to generation, far from the masses, shrouded in symbols, metaphors, and rituals. This knowledge was not merely intellectual, but initiatory. It demanded from the aspirant an inner transformation, purification of the heart, and mastery of emotions. The mystery schools of Egypt did not teach only with words, but with silence, trials, and light. Their teachings aimed at resurrection in life, the alchemy of the soul, the awakening of the being to its true nature. And it was in this cradle that, according to many occult traditions, Jesus would have been educated. These schools, known today as temples of wisdom, operated on a strictly selective basis. Merely being curious was not enough for admission. The disciple needed to demonstrate courage, high character, and a deep spiritual restlessness. In places like Karnak, Luxor, and Edfu, priests initiated the most prepared into knowledge that involved sacred astronomy, divine geometry, vibrational healing, energy manipulation, and the creative power of the Word. The Word, for these masters, was an instrument of creation, not just communication, an idea that strongly resonates in the teachings attributed to Jesus. The term mystery did not mean something hidden out of whim, but protected out of reverence. The universal truths that governed the workings of the cosmos, spirit, and matter were considered too sacred to be handed over to the ego or human pride. Therefore, their initiation rituals required absolute silence. There was no room for vanity, only for humility and surrender. And it is in this environment that many scholars believe that Jesus, still young, would have found resonance with his own mission, absorbing secrets that he would later translate into simple and profoundly transformative parables. Among the gods revered by the initiates, Thoth held a special place. Portrayed with the head of an ibis, he was considered the master of time, of the word, of writing, and of cosmic wisdom. The priests of Thoth taught the power of the word aligned with the heart and the mind, and their tradition was one of the most influential in Hermeticism. It's no coincidence that in the Gospels we find Jesus saying, "Truly I tell you." Each time he uttered such words, he echoed the principle that truth is a vibration that shapes realities. This principle is central in Egyptian schools. The structure of Egyptian temples was more than architectural. It was symbolic and initiatory. Each pillar, each hall, each gateway represented a stage in the soul's journey towards its reunion with the divine. The disciple would literally walk through these spaces while spiritually crossing the layers of ego, illusion, and matter. It was a pilgrimage into oneself. And this initiatory model was later reflected in various esoteric traditions, including mystical Kabbalah and Gnostic practices, all of them possibly influenced by the experiences preserved in the Egyptian temples. The initiation began with a confrontation with one's own shadow. The disciple was taken to dark chambers and subjected to physical and spiritual tests. Deprived of external senses, he was forced to look inward. After this period came the symbolic awakening of the inner light, usually accompanied by rites linked to death and rebirth. The idea of being born again, later so prevalent in Jesus' discourse, has very clear roots in this initiatory cycle. Jesus was not talking about a religious dogma, but about a deeply transformative process, a living metaphor drawn from ancient wisdom. The canonical Gospels themselves retain hints of this influence when they describe Jesus fasting in the desert, facing temptations, and emerging strengthened. This is the archetype of the initiate. He goes through the symbolic desert, confronts his passions, overcomes his limitations, and returns with a new consciousness. This inner journey is mirrored in the Egyptian myths of Osiris, who descends to the underworld, is dismembered, and is reborn with the help of Isis and Horus. Jesus, in saying, "Whoever wants to save his life will lose it," reaffirms the same principle. It is necessary to die to the ego, to be born to the spirit. Within these schools, time was experienced differently. The priests taught that the past, the present, and the future coexisted. This perception of time as a spiral, not as a straight line, shaped the way the initiates understood their lives. Reincarnation, for instance, was taught as part of the soul's evolutionary process. Consciousness expanded life after life, and the masters helped the disciples recall previous existences as a way to heal repetitive patterns. This idea, although erased from traditional Christianity, was present in early Christian communities, such as the Gnostics, another link with the Egyptian heritage. The Egyptian knowledge was essentially symbolic. Each animal, each color, each gesture carried a profound spiritual meaning, and it was through these symbols that the initiates learned to decipher the world. They understood that the external reality was merely a reflection of the internal reality, and that the gods were nothing more than archetypal aspects of the self. This understanding finds a parallel in Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of heaven being within us. It was not just a metaphor, it was a key to access the deepest truth of existence. It's important to remember that these schools were not occultist in the modern and often distorted sense of the term. They were shaping conscious human beings, committed to light, harmony, and the common good. Their teachings aimed to awaken love, compassion, truth, and connection with the whole. Nothing is closer to the essence of Christ, who preached unconditional love, forgiveness, and unity among all. In this sense, Jesus' contact with these traditions is not only possible, but makes sense within the consistency of his own path. By understanding Egypt as the cradle of mystery schools, we stop seeing it merely as a stage of pyramids and tombs and start to perceive it as a living library where knowledge was transmitted with responsibility and reverence. A place where the human soul was sculpted as if it were sacred stone. And it is in this setting that the hypothesis of the young Jesus absorbing this legacy ceases to seem improbable and becomes deeply plausible. For only someone who has traversed the corridors of the soul with courage is capable of touching others with words that span centuries. Egypt does not only preserve its history and hieroglyphs, it also harbors mirrors of the human spirit. And perhaps it was there that Jesus found not only answers, but confirmation of his mission. The silence of the sacred temples may have echoed in his soul, helping him understand that the true temple would one day be the awakened human heart. And so, Egypt ceased to be just a land and became part of a tradition of light, alive, eternal, and destined to be reborn in every being who seeks the truth. Long before Christianity blossomed in the mountains of Judea, a powerful teaching, shrouded in metaphors and symbolic codes, known as Hermeticism, was already spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin. Attributed to the mythical figure of Hermes Trismegistus, a fusion of Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, and Hermes, the messenger of the Greek gods, this tradition was not a religion, but a path of spiritual awakening. It taught that the human being is a mirror of the universe and that true knowledge is not outside but within oneself. The Hermetic texts, like the Corpus Hermeticum, speak of a single invisible God who inhabits all things, the same principle that, centuries later, would echo in Jesus' phrase, "The kingdom of God is within you." This lineage of wisdom has spanned centuries and withstood empires, wars, and censorship, remaining alive in the hearts of the initiated. It was not a tradition of the masses, but of seekers, and Jesus, with his style of teaching through parables, his focus on inner transformation, and his emphasis on love as the key to the universe, seems to align perfectly with the pillars of Hermeticism. What makes this connection even more powerful is the fact that many principles attributed to Hermes are identical to the maxims of Christ. "As above, so below," says Hermes. "Be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect," teaches Jesus. Both talk about unity, reflection, and correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Hermeticism also advocated sacred silence as a method of learning. Nothing was handed over to those who were not ready to understand. This tradition, preserved for centuries within Egyptian temples and later by Greek philosophical schools, was deeply rooted in Alexandria, the same city where Gnostic Christianity most flourished in the early centuries. It's no coincidence. Alexandria was the meeting point between Greek thought, Egyptian science, and the first Christian communities. It was there that many of the early Christians had direct access to Hermetic teachings. It's no exaggeration to say that in this spiritual melting pot, a new form of Christianity was being gestated, more philosophical, more internal, more luminous. The Gnostics, for example, believed that salvation came through knowledge, gnosis, not through blind faith. They claimed that humans possessed a divine spark, and that by awakening this spark, they freed themselves from the illusions of the world. This is the same Hermetic logic, and it is also an idea present in Jesus' speeches when he asserts that you are God's and that the truth will set you free. What later institutional Christian tradition treated as heresy might have actually been a lost link to Egypt and its mysteries. The apocryphal Gospels, such as those of Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene, reveal a spirituality much closer to Hermeticism than the theology that was established in Rome. In these texts, Jesus does not appear as a divine judge, but as a guide for self-knowledge, a master who invites the disciple to look within, to overcome fear, and to awaken to their eternal essence. "Whoever drinks from my mouth will be like me, and I will be like him," says the Gospel of Thomas, an unthinkable idea in traditional pulpits, but deeply consistent with the tradition of light that transcends time. This spiritual lineage, which links Hermes to Jesus, also connects two essential concepts: the Logos and the Word. In Hermeticism, the Logos is the creating principle, the divine reason that structures the cosmos. In the Gospel of John, this same Logos is identified with Christ. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This conceptual fusion is not accidental. It is evidence that Christian authors were indeed engaging in dialogue with older wisdom schools. They were not rejecting the past, but reinterpreting it in the light of a new consciousness. The very structure of the spiritual journey described by Jesus has Hermetic roots. First, the awakening, the perception that something is wrong, that reality is an illusion. Then the purification, renunciation of the ego, fasting, prayer, service to others. Next, the enlightenment, the understanding that we are one with the Father and that death is not the end, but a transition. This trajectory is mirrored in Egyptian and Hermetic initiations and demonstrates that the path of Christ may not have been a break, but a fulfillment of something much older. Interestingly, the very fathers of the Church, such as Clement of Alexandria and Origen, recognize the value of Hermes' teachings. They believed that God's truth manifested itself in various cultures and that the Greeks and Egyptians had received fragments of this truth before the coming of Jesus. For them, Christ was the full manifestation of what the ancients had only glimpsed. But over time, this more open stance was stifled by political and dogmatic interests that preferred to erase these connections rather than allow spirituality to flourish freely. With the rise of the Roman Empire and the consolidation of the Church as a power institution, many of the more esoteric elements of Christianity were hidden, forbidden, or destroyed. The Hermetic legacy was marginalized, and inner spirituality gave way to external structures, rules, and hierarchies. What was once an individual journey of self-discovery became a uniform belief system, where doubt was a sin and personal quest was suspicious. Thus, the bridge between Jesus and Hermes was covered but not broken. It remained alive in secret orders, in medieval mystics, in Renaissance alchemists, and more recently, in contemporary seekers. Today, in reconstructing this lineage, we are not seeking to deny Christianity, but to liberate it from the bonds that have made it unrecognizable. Acknowledging that Jesus may have been a visible link in an invisible tradition is a brave and transformative step. He did not come to establish a new religion, but to reveal an eternal truth that was already pulsating in Egypt, Greece, India, and in every corner where restless souls sought the infinite. He was, perhaps, the confluence point where all spiritual rivers met. And if the historical Christ was the visible apex of this lineage of light, then each one of us is called to continue this legacy, not with empty rituals, but with a life lived in truth, in love, and in constant pursuit of wisdom. This is the inheritance of Egypt, of Hermeticism, of Jesus, a silent yet living lineage, which calls us today to also be mirrors of the divine. Between the ages of 12 and 30 in Jesus' life, silence reigns in the Gospels. Not a single verse, detail, or concrete story about what the young Nazarene experienced during this lengthy interval. And yet, it is after this period that he re-emerges with an authority, a presence, and a knowledge that do not correspond with the typical path of a simple carpenter. What happened in this span of nearly 2 decades? The absence of records is not a mistake. It's a question mark that pushes us to investigate, reflect, and reconstruct with the fragments that time, manuscripts, and tradition have preserved on the fringes of official history. This silence sparked the curiosity of mystics, independent historians, and seekers from various spiritual traditions. For many of them, the hidden years of Jesus were, in fact, a period of intense preparation, of initiations and encounters with ancestral traditions. Among all possibilities, Egypt stands out with unique force, not only because of its geographical proximity to Galilee, but also for its ancient reputation as a center of spiritual wisdom. Furthermore, because the Gospel of Matthew itself affirms that the Holy Family took refuge in Egypt during Jesus' childhood, a detail that, for many, is an indication that there was more than just protection there. There was a mission. Non-canonical documents, such as the Arabic Gospel of Infancy and the Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi, present mentions and symbolisms that indicate the presence of Jesus in Egypt during later periods of his youth. In these sources, Jesus appears learning from foreign masters, healing with ancestral techniques, and dialoguing with wise men who mastered the mysteries of life and death. Although many of these works are considered apocryphal, they carry codes that deserve attention, not as dogmatic facts, but as keys to understanding what has been forgotten or deliberately hidden. The Egypt that Jesus would have encountered was not the same as in the pharaonic times, but still preserved, in the temples and remaining priestly orders, vivid echoes of the mystery schools. Alexandria, Memphis, Heliopolis, and Luxor still vibrated with the knowledge inherited from the times of Thoth and Isis. The initiates continued to practice deep meditations, symbolic rebirth rituals, energetic healings, and studies about the cosmos and the soul. It was a living knowledge, orally transmitted, and only to those who showed pure intention and awakened spirit. According to this line, Jesus would have been one of these chosen seekers. The Valley of the Nobles near Luxor houses tombs and chambers that were not just graves, but rooms for spiritual instruction, where priests imparted teachings behind closed doors. It's not unthinkable to imagine Jesus walking through these corridors, observing living hieroglyphs, listening to teachings about the cycles of the soul and the harmony between the visible and the invisible. This contact would not have transformed his essence, but polished his spirit. Jesus was already light, but during this time he would have learned to make this light converse with the world, with human pains, with time, and with suffering. It is during this period that many believe Jesus had direct contact with the tradition of the Eye of Horus, a symbol of the awakening of inner vision and mastery over emotions. Learning to see with the inner eye was essential for the initiate, as it meant transcending duality and perceiving reality with spiritual clarity. This same symbol reappears later in Jesus' discourses when he says, "The eyes are the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be light." Is this just a simple metaphor, or a direct reflection of the teachings he received in the Egyptian temples? The healing techniques that Jesus used also suggest advanced and timeless training. The use of hands, the command of words, the breath, the touch, and the loving intention, all these elements are present in the energy healing schools of ancient Egypt. For the priests of Isis, healing was not just a physical act, but a spiritual one. It was the channeling of vital energy through a purified body and a centered mind. The medicine of the temples combined plants, sounds, geometries, and silence. And the healing Christ that we know seems to reflect exactly this pattern. Another revealing point is the mastery that Jesus had over spiritual symbolism. He knew how to use archetypal images to communicate profound ideas. When he spoke of the bread of life, the living water, or the kingdom of heaven, he was not just using figures of speech. He was translating ancient concepts into a language accessible to the people. This ability to translate the eternal into the everyday is typical of great initiates, and Egypt, with its millennia of symbolic tradition, would have been the ideal setting to develop this skill with mastery. Some esoteric traditions claim that the young Nazarene underwent trials in underground temples, such as those of Dendera or Abydos, where rituals involved meditation in total darkness, immersion in acoustic chambers, and even experiences of symbolic death, followed by spiritual resurrection. These processes aim to kill the ego and liberate the spirit. Coincidence or not, when Jesus later says, "Unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God," he is, consciously or not, repeating the heart of the Egyptian initiatory process. Being born again was more than a conversion, it was a metamorphosis of the self. Although most Christian traditions have overlooked this possibility, mystical communities such as the Essenes preserved practices that came in part from ancient Egypt. And there are scholars who suggest that Jesus had profound contact with the Essenes before or after his journey along the Nile. The discipline, the fasting, the constant prayer, the ritual use of water and fire, all of this is present both in the Essene tradition and in Egyptian practices. Therefore, what we see is a continuity, not a break. Jesus would have drawn from various sources, but Egypt was, perhaps, the deepest wellspring. When Jesus emerges at 30 years old with the strength of an awakened master, he carries not just a message, he carries a presence, an authority that does not come from reading books, but from crossing invisible portals. The way he speaks, heals, forgives, confronts, and transcends is not that of a theorist. It's of someone who has walked through fire, faced their shadows, died to the old world, and was reborn with the light of the ancients in his heart. The absence of records then transforms into a fertile field of spiritual revelations. Thus, the hidden years of Jesus cease to be an empty mystery and become a bridge between what was and what will come, between the Egypt of the living pyramids and the Mount of Olives, between the secret initiation and the public teaching. This bridge is not just historical, it's symbolic. It points to the path that each of us is also called to walk, the path of the quest, of the plunge, of rebirth, and of light. On the hidden banks of the Nile, in regions that today seem like only forgotten stone ruins, a living memory pulses, the memory of the initiations that shaped the brightest souls of the ancient world. Referred to by some as the Valley of the Nobles, by others as the Valley of Silent Voices, this space between tombs and temples was more than a cemetery. It was a university of the soul, a place where death was not the end, but the condition to be reborn with awakened consciousness. And it is in this sanctuary veiled by the sands that many believe Jesus lived an essential stage of his inner journey, the ritual of silent transfiguration. For the priests of ancient Egypt, initiation was the highest form of education. It was not offered to many, only to those who demonstrated a true yearning for truth, integrity of heart, and spiritual courage. Those who passed through the gates of the Valley of Lost Rituals were not led to enlightenment through books or speeches, but by direct experience. They were led into darkness, forced introspection, confrontation with their own internal limitations. They went through narrow tunnels, fasted, remained in absolute silence for days, meditating under the earth. It was a literal rebirth, the symbolic return to the womb of the cosmos. These underground chambers were not just physical architectures. They were built with geometric and energetic precision, designed to activate dormant spiritual centers within the human being. Harmonic sounds, carved symbols, patterns of filtered light. Everything collaborated to induce altered states of consciousness. In places like Dendera, Abydos, and Saqqara, there were passages known only to the initiated, paths that led to absolute introspection. And according to Hermetic traditions, Jesus would have trodden these paths not as a visitor, but as a disciple in the process of inner ascension. Silence was the first lesson. The initiate needed to silence their thoughts, their fears, their expectations. For days, they would withdraw from the world and plunge into the abyss of their own being. In this empty space, the Egyptian masters taught that the soul begins to remember who it is. The sound of one's own heart became the beat of the universe. It was at this point that the initiate began to perceive the unity of everything, that there is no separation between them and the source, between the visible and the invisible. This creative silence echoes in Jesus' later speech. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray in secret. He was not referring to a physical room, but to the sacred chamber of consciousness. After this stage came the confrontation with the shadow. The initiate was placed in front of symbols that awakened fears, traumas, and repressed impulses. Statues of jackals, inscriptions about judgment, symbolic enactments of death and the weight of the soul, all of this with the aim of purifying the being, of allowing him to see himself without masks. The judgment of Osiris, where the heart is weighed against the feather of truth, was not just a myth, it was a mirror. And it is exactly this symbolic language that re-emerges in the words of Jesus about the pure in heart and the final judgment. Many of these rituals involved the use of water as a symbol of transition. Ritual baths in dark chambers, immersions in total silence, sometimes at midnight, under the stars. The water represented the forgetting of the old world and the preparation for birth into a new state of consciousness. And this reappears powerfully in Jesus' journey when, upon being baptized by John, he emerges from the waters and the heavens open, revealing to him his mission. It is the rite of passage in its purest form, perhaps learned in the secret waters of the Egyptian temples. There are esoteric records that speak of the Chamber of Reversal, a specific environment where the initiate was induced to a near-death experience. Lying in a symbolic tomb, he would remain motionless, in total darkness, until his spirit was freed from identification with the physical body. He was then instructed in the subtle planes, guided by invisible masters, and, if approved, would return with the memory of eternity. This practice, described by initiates from various times, coincides with the power of Jesus over death, his serenity in the face of suffering, and his awareness that life does not end in the grave. The light after these rituals was not just a metaphor. The initiate claimed to see the world with new eyes. He understood the language of the birds, felt the vibration of the stones, recognized the divinity in every being. This expanded perception is what the ancients called solar vision, a state in which the soul recognizes its origin and purpose. And it is no coincidence that, after the retreat in the desert, Jesus returns and begins to perform miracles, heal crowds, and speak with an authority that surpasses the masters of his time. He becomes the very living expression of the light he once saw in the sacred darkness. These practices were shared in absolute secrecy. The priests took vows of silence, and the initiates swore not to reveal the mysteries to those who had not yet embarked on the inner journey. This spiritual ethic preserved the sanctity of knowledge and prevented sacred power from being corrupted by ego. And even when Jesus begins his public ministry, He maintains this tradition, speaking in parables, concealing spiritual keys and symbols only accessible to those of pure heart. He does not abandon the mystery, he reveals it only to those who have eyes to see. The Valley of Lost Rituals has not disappeared, it has simply closed itself off to eyes that do not seek sincerely. Its tunnels are still there, its stones still vibrate, and its portals, invisible to the common world, remain active in the subtle planes. Jesus may have emerged from there as a new being, but what he received in those temples accompanied him until the end. Every gesture, every silence, every healing he performed may carry echoes of the whispers he heard among those columns. And now, more than 2,000 years later, these vibrations remain available to all who choose to cross themselves. This is not about mythology, but about memory. What was experienced in Egypt, what was taught in the Valley of the Lost Rituals, is not dead, just veiled. And perhaps Jesus' greatest miracle was having lived this journey and brought from it not untransmittable secrets, but seeds planted in parables, gestures, and looks. It is up to us to water these seeds and tread, each in their own time, the same path of silence, death, and rebirth. For as the ancient masters knew, one only sees the true light after crossing the darkest night. In the hidden depths of Egyptian tradition, there was a silent lineage of priests who did not dedicate themselves to the external worship of gods, but to the internal awakening of divine consciousness. These were the priests of the inner eye, also known as the sons of the Eye of Horus. They were not public figures. They were instructors of the invisible, trainers of the spirit, who guided initiates through symbolic labyrinths until their inner vision was fully activated. These priests did not teach with common words, but with living symbols, sound resonances, subtle gestures, and energetic presence. They were the masters of spiritual vision, and according to occult traditions, Jesus may have been one of the few foreigners admitted to their fellowship. The Eye of Horus, also known as Ujat, was more than a protective symbol. It represented the entirety of spiritual perception. It was the union of the mind's hemispheres, the balance of polarities, the awakening of the pineal gland, the meeting point between body, mind, and spirit. In the schools of the inner eye, initiates learned to silence the outer world until this subtle center awakened. They learned to sense the vibration of things before judging them, to perceive the invisible behind the visible. It is exactly this ability that shines through in the Gospels when Jesus knows the thoughts of people before they speak, or when he senses someone's energy by touching them amidst the crowd. These priests, often associated with the temples of Isis and Thoth, lived a secluded life, practicing fasting, silence, and intense spiritual visualization. The training was rigorous: meditations within symbolic sarcophagi, contemplation of geometrically arranged symbols, use of sound as a vibrational key. The goal was to create what they called a solar vision, a way of seeing the world with the eyes of the spirit, free from the distortions of ego and illusion. And this same language appears in Jesus' message when he says, "If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light." He is not talking about physical vision, but the activation of a higher vibrational state. According to some Gnostic traditions and apocryphal records, Jesus would have been initiated by a secret group of priests during his stay in Egypt. These encounters would not have been public, but carried out in hidden temples south of the Nile. There are symbolic references to this in the Gospel of Thomas, when Jesus states that, "What is hidden will be revealed." Some interpret this as a direct reference to the training he received in the Egyptian temples. The Master spoke with authority because he spoke from a trained inner vision, a spiritual clarity that is not acquired with doctrines, but with inner rebirth. The practices of these priests also involved the use of sound, not just as music, but as a tool for energy alignment. Certain tones activated subtle points in the body, unlocking fears, restoring spiritual memories, clearing perception. This vibrational wisdom is reclaimed in the power of Jesus' voice. He did not just speak, he commanded with the word. He healed with the word. He calmed storms with the vibration of faith. All this indicates that he deeply understood the mystery of internal resonance, which is at the core of the training of the priests of the inner eye. Another revealing point is the way Jesus recognized faith in people without them speaking. When he meets the centurion and states, "Truly I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." He is using a perception that goes beyond the common mind. This type of reading of people's internal energy was a central skill among the initiates of Egypt, especially among the followers of Thoth. They trained to capture the vibrational essence of others, discerning truth, intention, and purity based on invisible signs. Jesus, by acting in this way, demonstrates that he had surpassed the veil of appearances. The descriptions of his posture, his silent presence, the way he responded with questions or strategic silences, also align with the pedagogy of the Egyptian priests. They didn't provide ready-made answers, they provoked reflection. They led the disciple to discover for themselves, "Who do men say that I am?" Logos. Jesus asks his followers. This teaching method, Socratic before Socrates, is also the method of the initiatory masters of Egypt. Never feed the ego with certainties, but stimulate the spirit with paradoxes. In the temple of Ka-Mambo, simultaneously dedicated to Sobek and Horus, there were rooms where the initiates were exposed to opposing forces, light and shadow, sound and silence, masculinity and femininity. The goal was to integrate these opposites within oneself. It was the principle of wholeness, to be whole in order to see clearly. And it is this principle that resonates when Jesus invites his disciples to love even their enemies, not to judge, to forgive without limit. He is speaking of integration, of healing duality, of the vision that sees the whole, exactly as taught by the masters of the inner eye. The pineal gland, considered the eye of God by many ancient cultures, was the training center for these priests. They taught that this point allowed contact with other dimensions, memories of past lives, and the divine source itself. Practices such as fasting, rhythmic breathing, and silent contemplation were used for its activation. Jesus, during his retreats in the desert and his solitary nights of prayer, probably practiced exactly this, the awakening of the subtle center that connects the human to the eternal. And his own transfiguration on Mount Tabor can be understood as the culmination of this process, the physical body overflowing with fully activated spiritual light. Some traditions say that the priests of the inner eye kept an invisible book, not written with ink, but with vibrations. A book that could only be read in an altered state of consciousness. They said that whoever deciphered this book would become a light in the world. And this is precisely how Jesus defines himself. "I am the light of the world." It's not just poetry, it's a code. An acknowledgement that he accessed the eternal knowledge that transforms the being into a channel of the divine presence. Knowledge that is not memorized, it is lived. Thus, when we look at Jesus not only as a religious figure but as an initiate, as someone who was trained in the silence of the Egyptian temples, we begin to perceive a different narrative, deeper, more human, and paradoxically, more divine. A Christ who did not come to teach from nothing, but who rescued and embodied the oldest of traditions, that of seeing with the eyes of the soul, of perceiving with the heart, of transforming one's own life into a living temple. This is the legacy of the priests of the inner eye, and it could also be the secret that shaped Christ before the world recognized him. When looking closely at the Gospels, not as mere historical records or religious manuals, but as symbolic expressions of ancient wisdom, something extraordinary emerges. Seemingly simple phrases reveal themselves as keys that open doors to deeper dimensions of consciousness. Jesus did not speak merely to teach, but to provoke awakening, and many of his most emblematic sayings carry, under the veil of simplicity, direct echoes from the Egyptian mystery schools, codes that survived the destruction of libraries, religious censorship, and the passage of time. "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." This phrase, repeated many times in the Gospels, is not a casual appeal. It is the typical call of initiatory masters who knew that true understanding does not lie in literal hearing, but in inner listening. The Egyptian priests also used similar expressions to mark the beginning of revelations that required more from the disciple than intelligence. They required vibration, presence, surrender. Jesus used these phrases as a sign that what would follow was not for everyone, but for those who were ready. The parables, Jesus' preferred teaching method, are another clear sign of this hidden tradition. Instead of conveying direct truths, he chose simple, almost childlike stories, but which concealed universal spiritual truths. The sower, the tares and the wheat, the mustard seed, all are examples that, read superficially, may seem moralistic. However, when read with the eyes of the Spirit, they reveal layers of teaching about the nature of the ego, the stages of the soul, and the process of integrating light with matter, central themes also in Hermeticism and Egyptian traditions. A notable example is the parable of the kingdom of heaven as a treasure hidden in a field. On the surface, it's a simple allegory about spiritual value, but at its core is the Hermetic concept that the divine is hidden in the earth, in the flesh, in the material experience, and that the seeker needs to dig, to excavate, to die to the superficial, to then find the eternal. This is exactly the same principle present in the training of Egyptian initiates, who descended into underground temples to find the light within the darkness. The language used by Jesus when speaking of the kingdom of God is, in itself, deeply symbolic. He does not point outward to a place beyond the clouds. He clearly states, "The kingdom of God is within you." This is a revolutionary assertion, even today. It is the same teaching of the ancient Egyptians, who said that Duat, the invisible world, the true reality, was not a distant location, but a state of consciousness. The priests trained to access it through silence and meditation. And Jesus, by teaching this to the crowds, was conveying the secret of the initiatory schools in accessible language. The 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John also carry deep symbolism, mirroring the 7 initiatory portals of Egypt and the 7 subtle energy centers in the human body, known today as chakras. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. Each of these sayings can be associated with stages of soul enlightenment. They are affirmations that activate, unlock, awaken. They are not just words, they are frequencies. Another indication of the presence of hidden codes is the constant use of symbolic numbers: 3, 7, 12, 40. Jesus chooses 12 apostles, like the 12 constellations, the 12 houses of the zodiac, the 12 aspects of the inner self. He spends 40 days in the desert, like the 40 days of Egyptian purification. He resurrects on the 3rd day, a symbol of the universal Trinity and regeneration. These numbers are not chosen at random. They are part of a sacred vocabulary that dates back to the papyri of Hermopolis and the inscriptions of Karnak. They are coded signs that behind the story there is a spiritual map. The miracles attributed to Jesus also reveal an initiatory pattern: healing the blind, opening inner vision, making paralytics walk, restoring conscious action, resurrecting the dead, awakening the sleeping soul, multiplying loaves and fishes, revealing the abundance of divine consciousness. Each gesture is not just an external event, but a living metaphor for the stages of spiritual evolution. And this style of teaching through symbolic acts is also present in Egyptian rituals, where everything, from the incense to the arrangement of the stones, had a didactic function. The passages about the Father's house also carry mystery. When Jesus says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," he is directly evoking Egyptian and Hermetic cosmology, which recognizes multiple planes of existence, multiple dimensions of the soul. The world is not flat and fixed, but dynamic, multidimensional, vibrational. This teaching, which today finds support even in quantum physics, was already known to the priests of Isis and Thoth. Jesus, in speaking of this, offered to common people keys that were previously restricted to the initiates of the temples. Even the way Jesus dealt with the law, the Pharisees, and external rituals reveals that his mission was to reconnect the sacred with the essence, a principle also central in mystery schools. For him, the Sabbath was made for man, not the other way around. The true temple was not the building, but the body, the heart, the spirit. He reenacted the return to the essential. This was also taught in Egypt, that the external gods were merely representations of internal principles, that true worship was the living of truth, and that the most sacred temple was the awakened consciousness. The Gospels, therefore, are not just memories of Jesus, they are symbolic labyrinths, living archetypes, layers of wisdom that need to be decoded. When read with initiatory eyes, they reveal a spirituality that transcends religions, dogmas, and divisions. They reveal a Christ who did not come to impose a new doctrine, but to remind us of an eternal truth, that the divine dwells within us, and that all life is an initiatory process of returning to the origin. Thus, the Bible ceases to be just a sacred book and becomes a spiritual mirror. Every verse can be a portal, every gesture of Jesus an invitation to transformation. Behind the veil of simplicity, there are ancient codes, Egyptian seeds flourishing in Galilean lands. And the question that remains for each of us is, do we have eyes to see? Do we have ears to hear? For the codes are still alive, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets to those who dare to seek with an awakened heart. History is written by the victors, but spiritual truth, it does not bow before the sword or the crown, it merely hides, waiting to be rediscovered. What happened to the deepest teachings of Jesus, with his likely initiatory training in Egypt, with the sacred heritage that echoed from ancient temples? Why were these connections erased, distorted, or cast into oblivion? The answer begins to reveal itself when we understand that the tradition of light was not denied out of ignorance, it was prohibited by strategy. In the 4th century, when the Roman Empire decided to adopt Christianity as its official religion, the message of Christ needed to be reshaped. The inner spirituality, the call for the liberation of the soul, the journey inward, all of this threatened the model of external power based on control, guilt, and fear. It was far too dangerous to allow the masses to understand that the divine resided within them, that rituals were symbolic, that true authority was spiritual and silent. The empire needed an institutionalized, predictable, hierarchical faith. Thus, the prohibition was born. Councils like that of Nicaea, 325 AD, were not just theological meetings, they were political operations. Texts were chosen, others rejected. Apocryphal Gospels, many of which held initiatory keys and parallels with traditions such as Hermetism, were condemned as heresy. Works that spoke of a mystical Christ, of inner wisdom, and of a profound spiritual journey were silenced. In their place, there remained an institutional, formatted, domesticated Jesus, no longer the initiatory master, but the Savior anointed by the Roman throne. The result was the construction of an external Christianity which distanced the human being from their own inner light. The tradition of light, that which came from Egypt, from Hermes, from Osiris, from the stars, was replaced by dogmas, empty rituals, and cultivated fears. Baptism, which was a symbol of the rebirth of consciousness, turned into a social rite. The supper, which represented the integration of body and spirit, became a mechanical liturgy. Silence, which was the gateway to the divine, was replaced by sermons of obedience. Mysticism was exchanged for orthodoxy. But the echoes of forbidden knowledge did not disappear. In the following centuries, underground currents kept the flame of initiatory wisdom alive. The persecuted Gnostics spread their texts in jars buried in the Egyptian desert. Mystical monks, such as the Hesychasts in the east and the Cathars in the west, continued teaching about the inner light. Secret orders like the Templars and the Rosicrucians resumed elements of the light tradition at the risk of their lives. It was a silent, yet unbreakable spiritual resistance. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria was not an isolated incident. It was a symbolic operation. What was lost there was more than books. It was free access to a universal, integrative, cosmic spirituality. Hundreds of manuscripts linking Jesus to the Egyptian tradition, to spiritual astrology, to the alchemy of the soul, were incinerated or locked away in the Vatican's secret archives. Even today, many of these documents remain inaccessible, considered dangerous for revealing a side of Christ that does not fit within the confines of the churches. The figure of Mary Magdalene was also deliberately distorted. In the Gnostic Gospels, she appears as an initiate, master, and spiritual companion of Jesus. She represents the feminine principle of wisdom, the mirror of the Isis tradition. Her erasure was not casual, it was part of the prohibition of the sacred polarity. When Magdalene is reduced to a sinner, the tradition she represents is also dismantled. That of the sacred feminine, of healing, of intuition, of love as a transformative force. Erasing Magdalene was like erasing half of the light. During the Middle Ages, the Inquisition pursued everything that deviated from the official narrative. Alchemists, healers, meditators, visionaries, all were considered heretics, not for threatening God, but for threatening the monopoly of truth. All wisdom that pointed inward towards the awakening of consciousness was attacked. It was a new crusade, not against infidels, but against the secret guardians of the ancestral light. The same mysteries that Jesus would have learned in Egypt were now considered demonic. Even so, the light was never extinguished. It reappeared in other forms, in the Renaissance with the studies of Ficino, Bruno, Paracelsus, in the East with the Sufis and yogis, in the Christian occultism of Jacob Boehme, and more recently, in the esoteric schools of the 19th and 20th centuries. The tradition of light only changed its skin, but kept its essence. The human being is a living temple. Initiation is an internal process. The divine is not distant, but pulses in every atom of the being. This truth was persecuted, yes, but never forgotten. Today, the return of the tradition of light is happening quietly, in conscious communities, in individual seekers, in videos like this one. Jesus is being rediscovered not as the static icon of religion, but as the solar master of consciousness. His connection with Egypt, with the stars, with the unseen, is beginning to be restored, and this return does not come with temples or dogmas. It comes with memory, with intuition, with a thirst for truth. It's the call of the spirit to rediscover its oldest roots. The interdiction of the tradition of light was not the end. It was merely the dark chapter of an eternal story. What was hidden is now being revealed. What was silenced now resonates in the awakened voices. The Christ that emerges from this rescue is not the property of a religion, but a living archetype of human evolution. He represents the point where heaven and earth unite, where the old and the new meet, where Egyptian wisdom and the compassion of the heart become one frequency. Thus, upon recognizing that there was a deliberate effort to distance us from this tradition, we do not cultivate rebellion, we cultivate awareness. We know that all darkness is educational. Every lie teaches us to value the truth, and every attempt to control the light only makes it more desired. The tradition of light no longer needs to hide. It is returning, in us, by us, through us, and this revelation now is impossible to stop. After crossing the sands of Egypt, the corridors of mystery schools, the silences of initiation, the echoes of temples, and the hidden layers of the Gospels, one question rises stronger than ever. What does this tradition of light have to do with our life today? We are not here just to learn about a possibly forgotten part of Jesus' history. We are here to rediscover our own spiritual origin. Because the true meaning of revelation is not to feed the mind, it's to transform the being. By acknowledging that Jesus was possibly an initiate, a conscious heir of Egyptian wisdom, our perspective on him changes. And with that, the way we see ourselves changes too. We are no longer spectators of an unreachable miracle, but continuers of a living lineage. Jesus ceases to be just an external savior and becomes a luminous mirror of what we can become. His example becomes not a pedestal, but a bridge, and this changes everything. Because if he was formed in silence, in depth, in presence, then we can be too. Spirituality ceases to be dogma and becomes a process, a path that is tread day after day. The initiation that Jesus experienced in Egypt, if indeed he experienced it, was not to isolate himself, but to give with consciousness. And this is the call, no longer to repeat empty phrases, but to live as initiates. Cultivate silence. Reflect before speaking. Seek the inner light instead of begging for external validation. Touch the invisible with the soul. love with integrity, heal with presence, see with the eye that looks beyond matter. All of this is within our reach. We are on the brink of a great resurgence. The tradition of light, for a long time fragmented and hidden, is returning to pulse in the hearts of thousands of people who, tired of ready-made formulas, are rediscovering spirituality as a direct experience. Jesus, in this new horizon, is the elder brother who first walked the path. No longer the symbol of a divided religion, but the archetype of the complete human, the one who traversed the darkness and emerged as conscious light. He did not come to be worshipped, but understood. And now, more than ever, he needs to be lived. The words of Jesus take on new dimensions when viewed in the light of Egyptian initiation. Deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me is not about blind suffering, but about transcending the ego, carrying your own transformation, and walking the path of awakening. The cross, a symbol of death and rebirth, is also an alchemical key, used in Egypt as a representation of the union between heaven and earth, the Ankh. By integrating this symbolism, we realize that the message of Christ is much broader than we were taught, and much more relevant to our time. This awakening does not require stone temples, but living temples. Each lofty thought, each act of compassion, each mindful breath can be an initiation. No matter the external setting, the desert is within us. The silence of the lost valley is here, between one thought and the next. The light of the inner eye can be accessed now, with presence, with intention. Because the tradition of light does not belong to the past, it is timeless. It lives in every being who chooses to see beyond appearances, feel beyond words, and love beyond fear. The reconnection with these roots also heals ancient wounds. It undoes the separation between faith and reason, between East and West, between body and spirit. It reminds us that the wisdom of the world is not lost, just dispersed, and that the true seeker is the one who unites, who collects the fragments and reintegrates them. Just as Jesus integrated the traditions, just as the Egyptian temples integrated science, art, medicine, and spirituality, we too can be this point of convergence. Each awakened life is a new temple rising. This awakening is silent. It won't come with applause, but with peace. It doesn't announce itself with shouts, but is felt with clarity. The person who accesses this tradition doesn't seek to convince. They radiate, just like Jesus radiated. His authority came from within, from a center that didn't waver with others' opinions. He knew who he was, and that's what the tradition of light offers us, a reminder of who we are. Not temporary identities, but eternal consciousnesses living a temporary experience of growth and expansion. Today, more and more people are hearing this call. It doesn't have a specific name. Sometimes it appears as a restlessness, other times as a crisis. But deep down, it's always the same invitation, to return to oneself, to look inward, to rediscover the divine as presence and not as concept. It's the soul reminding that there is more, much more than what we were taught. It's the inner Christ calling back. It's the echo of Egypt resonating in the now. And this return is not individual, it's collective. As more consciousnesses awaken, a new frequency is established on earth. A vibration where compassion is strength, truth is light, and silence is gold. An era where the tradition of light is reborn, not as a new dogma, but as a way of life. A presence that transforms, heals, and inspires. A spirituality that does not divide, but unifies. That does not convince, but invites. That does not fear, but loves. We have come to the conclusion that it is not the end, but the beginning. Everything that has been revealed on this journey points inward, towards you. You are the temple. You are the initiate. You are the seeker and the path. If Jesus passed through the portals of Egypt and emerged as a mirror of light, it is because this same potential lives in each human being who dares to look towards the invisible. The veil has been lifted, the map has been shown. Now the step is yours, and what comes next is the true beginning. Mind unfettered, now it's up to you. If this journey touched something within you, if at any point you felt there is a hidden truth waiting to be revealed, I want to hear from you. Comment below which part of the tradition of light most ignited your consciousness today, or if you prefer, share a vision, a feeling, a memory. Your voice is also part of this awakening frequency. We are co-manifesting a new era, and every word of yours helps to expand this field of consciousness. Let's make this space a temple of shared wisdom. And if you felt that something still pulses, asking for more, you're right. What you've discovered here is just the beginning. Click now on the next video that's appearing on your screen. The Brotherhood of Light, the secret knowledge of Jesus that history erased. In it, we'll dive even deeper into the ancient knowledge that Jesus may have inherited, and that was erased from history, but not from the memory of the initiated. Mind Unfettered, you are part of this. Don't just watch, stay awake. The call continues, and the light, it's already within you.